After years of being overlooked, Vietnam veteran Frank Vega becomes an overnight sensation when he single-handedly takes down two thugs on a bus. But his newfound fame means nothing when his best friend is murdered, and the police do nothing. Determined to get justice, Frank takes matters into his own hands, one brutal fight at a time. To know what happened, watch till the end. Frank Vega is traveling by a bus when two punks step in. Seeing the boys, he starts remembering his teenage years, which he recalls as the simplest and happiest. He grew up as the son of small-town farmers and had a beautiful girlfriend named Jillian Murray. Wanting to make something in his life, he joins the army, but ends up wounded and tortured in Vietnam. After returning to the US, he undergoes rehabilitation and struggles to pick up the pieces of his old life. When Frank visits Jillian as an adult, he discovers she's married with two children. Hoping for a fresh start, he tries to join the police force, but his wounds lead to rejection. Finding a decent job proves impossible. Every employer demands a degree and experience that he doesn't have. With no other options, he starts selling a hot dog stand on the street. Before he knows it, 40 years have passed, and life has slipped away from him. This sets up Frank's backstory before the movie returns to the present. On the bus, the two punks start harassing a passenger, and Frank steps in, telling them to stop. Instead, they turn their anger on him, but he fights back, effortlessly taking them down. Other passengers capture the moment on their phones and upload the video to YouView, a platform that functions just like YouTube, under the title Badass. Overnight, Frank becomes a viral sensation. People begin painting his image on street walls as a tribute, celebrating his bravery and newfound status as a local hero. Later, he and Mrs. Vega, who is Franel's mother, are invited to LA mornings, where journalist interviews them. Suddenly, Frank earns the respect of both his community and the police. Officer Marlick even invites him to ride along on patrol. 3 months later, Frank's mother passes away. Father Miller delivers a heartfelt speech at her funeral, but Frank remains deeply saddened. Honoring her will, he donates all the cutlery to their local church and keeps the rest of her belongings for himself. Meanwhile, on TV, Mayor Williams announces plans to improve safety in the Latin quarters. Frank is preparing to move in with his best friend, Klondike, at his late mother's house. During the process, they pause to drink Mrs. Vega's liquor and reminisce about their time in Vietnam, especially how Klondike once saved Frank's life. They talk about the best day of their lives, believing it's still ahead of them. Klondike then hands Frank a pen drive, insisting it's important stuff and should be kept in Mrs. Vega's old safe. Before leaving, Klondike hints at a plan that could make them rich. Klondike steps out to go home when a car pulls up beside him. Two men get out, draw their guns, and threaten him, demanding something he insists he doesn't have. They also mention a man named Sebastian. Klondike manages to disarm one of them and fights back, taking both men down. But as he gains the upper hand, one of them gets up and shoots him from behind, killing him instantly. The attackers then flee the scene, leaving Klondike lifeless on the ground. The next morning, while Frank is still asleep, he gets a call delivering the heartbreaking news of Klondike's death. Shocked, he rushes to the Los Angeles County Department to see his friend. An officer hands him Klondike's belongings, and Frank leaves, devastated by the loss. That night, Frank heads to a liquor store to buy alcohol, but realizes he's short on cash. He tries to convince the clerk to let him pay the rest tomorrow, but the shop owner refuses. Suddenly, 3 armed robbers storm in, threatening the owner and demanding money. One of them mocks Frank, calling him an old garbage man. Enraged, Frank unleashes his fury, taking down all 3 robbers with brutal force. Impressed and a little intimidated, the shop owner hands Frank a bottle of alcohol for free. As Frank leaves the shop, he runs into his neighbor, Amber Lamps. Sensing his grief, she offers him some comforting words about Klondike's death. She then shares her own pain. Her brother was killed just 2 blocks from where Klondike was murdered. Amber expresses her frustration, saying the neighborhood is becoming dangerous, with murders happening regularly and no one doing anything about it. Frank assures her that the police will take action, but she shakes her head, calling them corrupt. They need a real hero who can truly solve this issue. The next day, Frank heads to the police station to get updates on Klondike's case. However, Detective Shaw, who is in charge, isn't investigating the murder, dismissing it simply because Klondike was black. As he is about to leave the office, he sees some police officers playing games instead of working. Frustrated and disgusted, Frank decides not to go out with his cop friend and decides to take the matters in his own hand. Frank heads to the spot where Klondike was killed, carefully searching the area. He finds an unusual cartridge and a necklace belonging to one of the killers, with a photograph inside. Determined to uncover the truth, he takes the cartridge to a nearby pawn shop and asks the owner if it was recently sold. The owner says he doesn't deal in them, but reveals that this type of cartridge is issued only to government armed forces. When Frank shows him the necklace, the owner recognizes the woman in the photo as his wife's friend and believes it likely belongs to her husband. He then gives Frank an address, and without hesitation, Frank sets off to investigate. Frank goes to the man's home and hands the necklace to his wife. She seems frustrated with her husband, Terrence, complaining that he barely spends time with her. When Frank asks about his whereabouts, she says she hasn't seen him in a week, but suggests he might be at 22nd Street Park. Frank heads there and finds a group of men playing basketball. When he asks about Terrence, they refuse to answer and instead start provoking him. Unfazed, Frank takes down one of them with ease. Fearful of his strength, the others quickly give in, telling him to check 85th Street, where a man named Ronaldo might have the answers he's looking for. Frank arrives at Ronaldo's apartment, but Ronaldo is nowhere to be found. Instead, he encounters a man dressed as a priest. Pressing him for information, Frank learns that Terrence is often seen at a nightclub called Velvet Scorpion. Meanwhile, Mayor Williams meets with his street contact, Panther. With only 90 days left until re-election, Williams is desperate. His corrupt dealings are stored on the missing pen drive, and if it falls into the wrong hands, his career is over. He's especially worried about Frank. Panther, however, remains confident. He assures the mayor that he controls the streets and will handle Frank personally. He admits his men botched Klondike's murder, but promises that this time, they'll do it right. Frank heads to the nightclub and asks about Ronaldo. The bartender points him upstairs, and without hesitation, Frank rushes up to confront him. Ronaldo, sensing trouble, pulls out a knife and refuses to talk about Terrence. But Frank grabs him and dangles his head out the window, forcing him to crack. Terrified, Ronaldo spills the truth. Terrence has been spending time with a woman named Tatiana at a massage parlor. Later, Frank returns home, only to be ambushed by a massive thug, demanding the pen drive. The thug viciously slams Frank to the ground, but Frank, fueled by anger, fights back and tosses the man out of his house. Realizing the drive holds something important, he takes it to Martin, a tech-savvy kid next door. Together, they extract the files and uncover shocking evidence. Detailed plans for the forced gentrification of the entire neighborhood. Frank heads to Tatiana's massage parlor, where she begins his session, and when he asks about Terrence, she abruptly leaves midway, mentioning that she has broken up with Terrence. Sensing something off, Frank decides to follow her home. Slipping inside, Frank finds Terrence and Tatiana in the middle of an intimate moment. Terrence panics and reaches for a gun, but Frank swiftly overpowers him. To make him talk, Frank shoves Terrence's hand into the garbage disposal, slicing several of his fingers. In agony, Terrence confesses that Klondike was killed by a man named Sebastian and that Panther was the one who ordered the hit. Frank storms into Panther's garage, determined to confront him. He demands to see Panther, but the guards claim he's unavailable. Just then, Panther steps out, and Frank immediately asks why he killed his friend. Panther coldly admits that Klondike stole his flash drive, which holds vital information, and demands its return. Playing dumb, Frank acts like he doesn't know what a flash drive is. Seeing through the act, Panther knocks him out, ties him to a chair, and tortures him with electric shocks, the same cruel method Frank once suffered in Vietnam. They search Frank's wallet, and Panther finds a photo of Amber and smirks, threatening to go after her next. With that, he leaves to hunt down Amber. Frank grabs a lighter and takes out one of Panther's goons, triggering chaos. The fight intensifies as flames spread rapidly, turning the garage into an inferno. Frank battles his way through Panther's men. Panther flees and hijacks a bus from a driver. When Frank approaches another bus driver and says he needs to take his bus, the driver, recognizing Frank as a legend, happily hands over the wheel. Frank speeds after Panther, causing mayhem through the streets. The chase barrels through the city until Frank collides with a building. Panther heads to the LA market for a final showdown. At the last moment, Frank swerves, but Panther isn't so lucky. His bus gets obliterated by an oncoming train. Panther reaches Amber's house first and tries to harm her, but Frank arrives, and the two engage in a fierce fight inside the house. The struggle spills outside, where Frank lands a brutal punch, leaving Panther bloodied and forcing him to kneel on the ground. Amber takes Frank inside to tend to his wounds, while Panther is left outside in the garden, bloodied and motionless on the ground. Meanwhile, a journalist reports that while many remember Frank Vega as badass, he has now exposed a massive political corruption scandal, revealing the mayor's ties to a violent street gang. The mayor, trying to save face, claims he's under attack by special terrorist groups aiming to sabotage his political and economic plans. As a reward for his actions, Frank is named an honorary police officer, and Malark hands him a badge. Stunned, Frank is left speechless. Later, he joins Amber and her son for dinner. As they enjoy their meal, Frank reflects on the day, calling it the best of his life. With a grin, Amber's son looks at him and says, "Now trim that damn beard." Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe for more interesting movie recaps.